I often stay up late at night to clean my house. I've always been a night owl, and now that I have a family of my own, I find it much easier to stay up late at night cleaning once everyone else has gone to bed. One night, a few months ago, I ended up staying up late into the early hours of the morning. I was tinkering with something in the living room by the mirror when I looked up. What I saw staring back at me when I looked up into that mirror still gives me nightmares to this day. As I glanced into the mirror, my reflection was smiling at me, which doesn't sound so scary in itself. The problem is I wasn't smiling. My blood ran cold, and I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. The smile was very subtle, but it certainly wasn't friendly. It was sinister. I totally freaked out. I blinked a few times, and then before I knew it, my reflection was back to normal. I now always make sure I'm in bed before 3 AM. Ever since I was a little girl, I've been haunted by something in my dreams. As I grew older, I moved from one continent to another, yet those dreams always followed me. Whatever it is in those dreams seems to want to disguise itself as something that it's not, as if it doesn't want me to see its true form. The first time I ever dreamt of it, it took the form of a Virgin Mary painting from my church. It was smiling at me. I recognised the exact same smile that night when I looked in the mirror. I'm now 32 years old, and it still appears in my dreams from time to time. It disguises itself as a friend or relative, but it can never hide that hideous smile. Lately, I feel like it's been trying to gain my trust, as if it's trying to manipulate me in some way. I can never remember precisely what it says, but I always get that stranger danger feeling. I sense it every time I see that smile. In my dream, I begin relentlessly and desperately praying to God until I wake up. There has been other incidents over the years. On one occasion, my old cat totally freaked out while I was holding her. She started hissing and clawing to get away from me, whilst staring over at the corner in my room. She was a really placid cat, so this was totally uncharacteristic of her. I remember picking her up and taking her back into the room to try to calm her down. But as soon as we entered that room, she behaved in exactly the same way. Hissing, hairs standing up on end, clawing to get away from me. To be honest, I never saw a thing in that room, but I keep praying to God and hoping for the best. Any serious advice would be much appreciated. When I was younger, maybe 7 or 8 years old, I lived with my grandma in a gated community. Everybody in the area was super nice, and me, my sister, and my best friend at the time, Alex, were the only kids in the area, so we were all very good friends. We pretty much did everything together and spent all of our free time hanging out. One summer, we decided to have a sleepover together. We'd never done this before, but my grandparents agreed and said it was okay, and Alex's parents agreed too. My sister decided not to join in the sleepover because she had a massive crush on Alex. Anyway, we kicked the sleepover off at about 4 PM and started to play some video games. We eventually had dinner and watched YouTube until it was time for bed. I think it's important to mention at this point that I have trouble sleeping. I always have done. This is a result of my insomnia and sleep paralysis. As this was the case, I was awake periodically throughout the night, tossing and turning or getting up to use the bathroom. Alex, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. He could sleep like a rock, regardless of the conditions. At one point during the night, I woke up feeling very cold, despite having blankets on me. I looked around and noticed that Alex was sitting up on his bed, staring at the wall. I asked him what's up, and he just tells me, "Shush." And then he said, "You're going to wake them." Now, at this point, I assumed that Alex meant his parents. Maybe he was doing something that he shouldn't have been doing, and didn't want to wake them up. I shrugged it off and managed to fall asleep again. This happened 2 to 3 times during that night. I would wake up, and he'd just be sitting there, and he'd say, "Shh, don't wake them." I had absolutely no sense of time back then, so I just assumed this had happened over a span of minutes, and I just never fully fell asleep. That was until I woke up, and a shiver went down my spine. I was sweating a lot, and I was shivering all over. I don't know about you, but I shiver when I'm scared. Something in my mind was telling me to just close my eyes and go back to sleep. But I didn't. I was curious to see if Alex was still up. So I opened my eyes. As I opened my eyes, Alex was standing directly above me, staring down at me. Something was really off about his eyes. That's how I knew something was wrong. They were his eyes, but they weren't his eyes. There was something different about them. I asked him again what he was doing, to which he simply replied, "Awake." I assumed he meant his parents, so I said, "Are they mad?" To which he replied, "Yes, very, very mad." While he was talking, his body was as stiff as a statue. After he finished his sentence, I felt a drop of water hit my face. I wiped it away and stood up so I could look at him properly. I could see that Alex was crying. I'm one of those awkward people that never knows what to do when someone's crying, so I just kinda looked at him. "They took me away," was all he said. After that, I decided to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, Alex was back in bed. So I went to bed too, and I managed to sleep through until the next morning. After we ate breakfast, we went to the local community swimming pool, where I confronted him about what had happened last night. He said he had no recollection of doing or saying anything during the night. He really thinks I'm joking when I tell this story. I'm definitely not joking. Due to the nature of my job, I'll be changing the names of everyone affected and or involved in one of the most terrifying nights I've ever had. The things I'm about to share actually happened to me one night while I was at work. I'm what's known as a personal care attendant or a direct support worker. I work one-on-one with a disabled client. My client, who we'll call Nate, was around 29 years old at the time. Unfortunately, Nate was involved in a freak accident 3 years prior to this. He was accidentally shot in the neck by a stray bullet while he was sitting on the porch of his grandfather's home. This tragic accident left him quadriplegic, meaning he's paralysed from the neck down. I've worked with him for many years now. At that time, I worked from 5 PM to 7 AM while my cousin was at work. I do everything my client is unable to do, from housework to cooking to everyday tasks. Pretty much anything he needs help with, as well as taking care of his 4 kids. After I put all the kids to bed, I got Nate settled for the night. I went through the house and made sure all the lights were turned off and all the doors were locked. They had a security system too, but for some reason I forgot to arm it that night. It was about 10 PM when I went to my cousin's bedroom to watch a movie on my laptop before I went to sleep. About an hour into the movie, I decided to go to the kitchen to grab a drink. It was dark, but I'm very used to the layout, so I didn't bother turning any of the lights on. I heard a sound coming from the front door. Initially, I didn't recognise the sound, but after a few seconds, I realised it was the doorknob to the front door rattling. I have experienced a fair amount of paranormal activity in this house over the years. I peeked out to see if anyone was at the door, and no one was there, so I assumed it was just that. I checked all the doors and windows, made sure everyone was okay, and went back to bed to finish my movie. After about 10 minutes, my laptop started acting up. It froze and started making a very high-pitched noise that I'd never heard before. I restarted the laptop, but the noise persisted. I shrugged it off and decided I was getting tired anyway, so decided to go to sleep. Just as I lay down, I heard footsteps in the hallway, going towards the children's bedroom and the room that I was in. So, I got up, flipped the light on, and looked out into the hallway. No one was there. Once more, I went through the house, checking everyone was okay and making sure all the doors and windows were locked. At this point, I started to feel incredibly anxious. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep now, so I turned the TV on and turned the volume down low so I didn't disturb anyone. This is when I heard a very familiar voice say my name. It sounded exactly like my dad. The problem here is, my dad had passed away 10 years before this. I sat up and looked around the room. Again, no one. Now I'm thinking I'm not going to go to sleep at all. The level of activity was much stronger than usual. So I decided to use the voice recorder tool to find out what was going on. After asking some questions, I heard the voice of a young boy. For reference, my client's children are all girls. It sounded like he said, "Need to be careful." I tried to ask more questions, but I was so tired. Out of the corner of my eye, in the reflection of a large picture frame, I saw something move. I also heard some movement, so I turned to look. I couldn't see anyone directly in front of me, but I swear to God, when I turned to look in the reflection of that picture frame, I could see my uncle standing right behind me. My uncle had also passed away just a few years prior. Then I heard him say, "You can't go to sleep." I'm a paranormal investigator, so there's not much that really freaks me out. However, I'd never experienced this kind of activity before. It was close to 2 AM at this point, and almost 3 hours of constant activity. I finally decided I'd had enough, and I walked over to the nightstand. I grabbed the remote to the security system and pressed the button to arm it. I thought to myself, this is crazy. I just need to get some sleep. I had to be up in a few hours to get the girls ready for school. I stuck my knee on the bed, and at that exact moment, someone kicked the back door in of the house, which is located in the kitchen. The security system went off. It was really loud, and lights started flashing all over the house. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and ran towards the back door. I didn't see anyone. One of my biggest fears is someone breaking in. As I was on the phone, I checked to see that everyone was okay, and there actually wasn't anyone in the house. My cousin called because the security company had called him to say that there'd been an alert that somebody had broken into the house. My cousin told them that it was probably an accident, so I told him to call them back immediately. I said, "Someone just kicked your fucking back door in. I'm not disarming this alarm system until the police get here." We never found out who tried to break into that house. But nobody will ever convince me that all the paranormal activity that I experienced that night wasn't someone trying to warn me about what was about to happen. It was truly as if they were doing things on purpose to get my attention, to make sure I armed the alarm system before I went to sleep. If I hadn't, God only knows what would have happened. I'm not really afraid of the paranormal. It's the living I'm afraid of. And this story is a perfect example of that. Okay, so I'm a 15-year-old female. Me and my twin sister, Sophia, were in our beds in our own rooms on the night this happened. I was trying to get to sleep when I could hear heavy footsteps from outside my bedroom door. I texted Sophia to ask her what the hell she was doing. I presumed it was her, because it was only me and her in the house that night, as our parents were out. She replied with, "I'm in bed, dumbass." I called her a liar, so she sent me a picture of herself in bed. The footsteps started moving in circles around the house for around another 20 minutes or so. I decided to try to ignore it and rationalise it in my head as much as possible. But deep down, I was absolutely petrified. About 30 minutes later, Sophia sent me a text saying that she'd heard a light switch turn on and off about 3 times. I told her that maybe it was a good idea if she came and slept in my room, as I was getting genuinely freaked out. She told me she was too scared to move. So, I got up and ran to her room as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me and turning on the light. When I climbed into her bed, things just seemed to get weirder. After about 10 minutes of being in her room, the footsteps started again. Exactly the same route as before. They started in the kitchen, down into the living room, then back around to the hallway that led to our bedrooms. And then it would repeat over and over again. We kept hearing light switches clicking on and off all around the house. The heating kept kicking on and off as if somebody was messing with the thermostat. It's normally very warm in my sister's bedroom because she has 2 heat vents in there. But it had gone freezing in there now, and every once in a while we would feel a breeze. Bear in mind, no windows or doors were open in that house anywhere. We started to hear tapping on her bathroom door and on the walls, and it sounded very much like somebody kept opening and closing the door to the cleaning closet next to the kitchen. We were both absolutely frozen with fear, too scared to move. Neither of us really had any knowledge of the paranormal, and we'd never experienced anything like this before. Once the noises eventually stopped, we decided to get up and search the whole house together. We didn't find anything out of place. All the windows and doors were still locked shut, meaning nobody entered or exited that house. Again, we have no experience with this kind of stuff, so any advice would be very much appreciated. Okay, so I just finished a 6:30 p.m. exam, held at the upper wing of our school building. The upper wing has the classrooms. The lower wing holds the lobby and has an elevator to the left and a staircase to the far right. Since the building has glass walls and has Christmas lights strewn all over the glass facade encasing the lower wing, maintenance has the lower wing at lights out after 6 p.m, purely for aesthetic purposes. The outdoor Christmas lights really pop this way. Anyway, so I just finished my exam, which was held in room 402. I was one of the very first students to finish the exam and leave the room. When I exited the exam room, I was alone in making my way to the lower wing where the lobby is at. I was ready to descend the staircase. That's when The elevator, right behind me, just opened. I looked over, and it was so brightly lit that it illuminated the whole dark lobby. But nobody was at the lobby except for me, and nobody was inside the open elevator at all. I noticed that the call button was lit too, and it indicated that it was going down. So I thought to myself, maybe somebody exited really fast, and accidentally pressed a button or two before leaving. I found it weird, but paid it no mind. I continued descending to the third floor via the staircase, and then, right when I landed at the third floor lobby, the elevator opened again. It cast an unusually bright light from the other end of the floor. I looked over again, and I saw that once more nobody was inside the elevator, and nobody was at the lobby at all. Once again, the call button was lit as if it had been pressed, and it indicated that it was still going down. I was getting nervous at this point, and I just couldn't bear to look into that elevator for too long. So, keeping my eyes on my shoes, I hurried down the staircase to the second floor. That's when it happened, for a third time. The elevator doors opened right when I reached that second floor. It cast its light on the whole lobby, and once again showed that nobody was inside the elevator. Nobody was there, and nobody was at the lobby, meaning that nobody could have pressed that call button, and yet it was still going down. No one was there, and yet I had an unwavering feeling that somebody was glaring at me from inside that elevator. I raced as quickly as I could down to the ground floor. This time, I was too fast for the elevator. The ground floor, which was empty, was also at lights out. But the main doors leading outside allowed some light and some noise in. I ran out of the building as fast as I could, and I only got to relax a couple of paces outside the building. Just then, a classmate called out to me from the benches just outside the building, and I felt an instant sense of relief. Now that I'm finished writing this, I just remembered that during our midterm exams, one of the proctors for an evening exam had told us that he once saw the ghost of a young boy inside room 401. Room 401 just happens to be right next door to the room in which I took my exams. It became a bit of a dumb rumour for a while, but nobody really cared. The house that I grew up in, the same house that my parents and one of my brothers still live in to this day, is very active with benevolent spirits. For some quick context, I grew up sharing a house with two female spirits. I felt their energy, had encounters, and still notice them lingering around when I go to visit my parents still to this day. One of the most intense encounters, however, happened back in 2007. I was 13, my brother was 12, and the twins were 7. It was a humid day, with thunderstorm warnings and dark skies. I remember it being late summer, and the whole week before this was thunderstorm after thunderstorm. The storms knocked the power out, leaving the house dimly lit by candlelight. My parents were in the garage, trying to get the generator to start, so that my mother could at least have a cup of tea by boiling water from the kettle. Us kids, of course, wanted to be able to charge our Nintendo DS's. Since that was our obsession, like many kids growing up in the mid-2000s. I was sitting in the basement with my brothers. We were all sitting, waiting for the power to come back on. Our DS's were completely drained of power, and we were wondering what to do. My brother, Chad, mentioned that he wanted to go upstairs to grab something from the bedroom, but he was too afraid to go alone. I remember saying something along the lines of, "I'm sorry," Are you not able to go up there by yourself? Chad stared at me intensely. He said, I could, but I want you to come. I knew he was afraid of the dark, so I didn't bother to question him anymore. So, together, we climbed the stairs from the basement. We walked through the tiled hallway that connects to the kitchen, and then turned left to face the stairs that lead up to the second floor. It was only 10 steps or so it wasn't a very steep or strenuous climb to take. There was just pitch black in front of us. A deep, foreboding feeling was running through me. I've always felt very much in tune with my intuitions and try my best to listen to them. But things happened so suddenly before I had chance to react. With our flashlights still pointing up the stairs, lightning flashed and illuminated the hallway. If you were standing where me and my brother were standing, you would have seen a hallway at the top of the stairs. This hallway only went on for about 12 feet or so before you came to the door of a linen closet. Standing right in front of that linen closet at the end of the hallway was a woman. The brightness of the lighting almost hurt my eyes, yet I could still make out the figure of this woman standing in the hallway. She was wearing a long skirt and a button-up shirt. I couldn't place an exact time period to the clothes, and I still can't to this day. But I do know it was years, if not decades, prior to 2007. The lady wasn't facing us. She was staring off to the left of the hallway towards my brother's bedroom. I can remember this intense feeling of fear. I think this was more because we definitely weren't expecting to see the apparition of a woman standing before us. It wasn't necessarily because I felt like she was evil. After what felt like about a minute, me and Chad bolted into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa. We both sat there wide-eyed, just staring into space, trying our best to come to terms with what we'd just seen. Luckily, nothing paranormal or strange happened for the rest of that evening. Eventually, we went back downstairs to the basement, and our parents managed to get the generator working once more. We played on our video games and tried our best to forget what we saw. But I remember wondering who that apparition was. I had previous encounters with the spirit of a girl I named Tara. But this couldn't be Tara. Tara was much younger. From then on, I realised Tara wasn't the only spirit in our home. This woman would make more appearances in the future, but she never gave me any impression that she meant us any harm. When I was admitted to hospital, I had several encounters that I'll never forget. In my opinion, this hospital looks really old. I was admitted there because it was our nearest hospital, and down the years most of my family have been treated at that hospital. It sort of became our family hospital. I had to have surgery, and then I suffered an infection, which meant that I was warded for almost a week. The first 2 nights were pretty uneventful. The paranormal stuff only began on the 3rd night. There was an old lady beside me when I was admitted. Her family seemed very friendly, and they did tell me that she was suffering from dementia. Therefore, she was spouting nonsense most of the time, but I found it quite entertaining. She kept mistaking me for her daughter, and often called me by her daughter's name, although she said things that didn't make much sense. However, on the 3rd night, she said something that absolutely scared the shit out of me. She held her frail, shaking hand up in front of her and extended a finger. Pointing across to a bed on the other side of the room, she said, "Rose, ask that lady to stop staring at me. She's scaring me." I turned my head to face the direction she was pointing in. The bed was empty. This sent a chill down my spine. Although I tried to ignore it at first, she started shrieking more often. She kept pointing at that bed, claiming that somebody was staring at her. I called the nurse, and she covered that bed area with a curtain, and it all stopped. The next day, however, the same thing happened. But this time, it creeped me out way more. Instead of pointing to the bed opposite, she pointed to the chair next to me. She was screaming, pointing at that chair. "Please tell her to leave me alone." I slowly turned my head to face that chair. Of course, there was nobody there. Without warning, that chair shifted back at least a few inches. The old lady in the bed let out a blood-curdling scream. Then, everything fell silent. On the 5th day, the old lady was discharged, and I was alone on the ward, of course with the nurses. This is when the final incident took place. While I was lying in bed, minding my own business, I noticed something moving outside the window. Something was swaying back and forth. When I turned to face it, I could see a white cloth hanging on the tree outside. It was just a cloth, but it was quite obvious to me that something wasn't quite right about that cloth. I lay there, staring at it for a while. There was no wind, no leaves or branches were swaying. Yet this cloth was moving backwards and forwards, when suddenly it just flew up into the air. I turned my body to the other side, to face the other way and avoid looking at that tree. The night went by, and I woke up in the middle of the night, facing the window. Something was telling me to expect that cloth to be hanging from that tree again, but there was nothing there. So, I just decided to turn back over and try to fall asleep. When I turned back over, what I saw was absolutely terrifying. I swear when I say that that white cloth was now on the chair right next to me. I tried to turn my body, but I couldn't move. So I just decided to close my eyes and say a prayer. At that point in time, I sort of wished that that old lady was still there. Eventually, I fell asleep, and thankfully, more people were admitted to the ward the very next day. This story might not sound like much, but I've never been so freaked out in all my life. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Before I tell this story, I'd like to start by saying that I'm a huge believer in the paranormal. I've been having paranormal encounters and experiences since I was a child. I love things of a paranormal nature. I have a ghost tattoo, and I named my cat Boo. I own ghost hunting equipment, and I've been ghost hunting everywhere from Savannah, Georgia to California. It's my passion. The amount of paranormal or unexplained stories I have are countless, and most of them are harmless. But one encounter made me take a step back from paranormal investigations for quite some time. This is the story of what happened that night. It was 10 p.m. on the 8th of May 2020. I got into my car to go to pick my little sister up from her friend's house, which was only about 8 minutes from where we lived. I got into my car like normal, started the engine, and proceeded to drive to her house. It's important to point out that immediately, as soon as I got into my car, something didn't quite feel right. I chalked it up to the fact that I was driving a car without a licence, but I couldn't shake this feeling off. Because of this unsettling feeling I had, I never turned any music on and decided to drive in silence. I wanted to be extra careful and really aware of my surroundings. It's also important to know that me and my best friend have always said that flashing lights, or flickering lights in general, are kind of an ominous warning. This is due to past experiences. So I'm driving through this neighbourhood that I've been through a million times. Out of the corner of my eye as I'm driving, I notice this porch light turn on and off, on and off. I said to myself out loud, "Okay, I see you." But I didn't really think that much of it, and continued on my way to pick up my little sister. Eventually, I came to a stop sign. And again, the street light above me turned off and on, off and on. I froze for a moment just staring at that light. I took a deep breath and continued driving. Eventually, I reached the turning for the road that she lives on. I took the turn and started driving down the road. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed somebody's garage floodlights flickering on and off alarmingly fast. So fast, I thought the bulb was about to blow. I stared out of my driver window and slowed down as I looked at this light. My head was out the window as I approached a rolling stop. I was totally caught off guard. Out of the corner of my eye, I could clearly see somebody sitting in the seat behind my passenger seat in my car. My heart froze, and I knew I needed to double check what I'd seen. I stopped my car completely in the middle of the road to turn all the way around. Clear as day, there was a man sitting on the back seat of my car, and I can describe him to a T. His head was down, but he had blonde hair parted to the side. His arm was resting on the armrest of the door. I can't quite remember his clothing, but I do remember that I was incredibly scared. I was staring at him in total shock, when all of a sudden he jerked his head up and stared straight back at me. His eyes looked incredibly sunken. His whole face, in fact, looked kind of distorted. He had a really long pointy nose and bushy eyebrows. I could tell that he was very tall, abnormally tall in fact, because his knees were up so high they were practically against his chest. He didn't say a word, but I could hear his breathing, and I could see his chest rising and falling with each breath. He was there, and I could see every detail of him. There was no way on earth it was my imagination, and I stared at him for what felt like days, when in reality it was probably no more than 15 seconds. I must have glanced away for no more than a second, when all of a sudden he was gone. I didn't see him fade away or anything like that. 1 second he was there, and then he wasn't. I got out of my car and looked all around, outside and inside, but I found nobody. I was so confused and absolutely convinced that there was a living, breathing man sitting on the back seat of my car. The worst thing was the way he made me feel. I've seen ghosts before, and in my experience they never tend to acknowledge me, and very rarely do they give off a negative energy. But he did. When I was looking at him, time seemed to freeze. I really felt like I was in danger. The feeling was incredibly ominous. I really felt like he wanted to hurt me. There's no doubt about it. It was malevolent. I got back in my car and continued the drive to my sister. I picked her up and we headed home. I was holding back the tears and shaking like a leaf. The thing was, I knew deep down the whole drive that something wasn't right. I knew I wasn't alone the whole drive, and I knew that those flashing lights were a warning sign. That man absolutely scared the hell out of me. I came home and broke down into tears trying to tell this story. After this happened, I went to visit a medium and sold the car immediately. I stopped ghost hunting for a good while. What do you think this was? My very first paranormal experience happened when I was 7, and we'd just moved into a small farmhouse in New Hampton, New York. The house still stands today, albeit in disrepair, but it is still there. When we first moved in, it was a series of spider webs and dirty floors. The attic was full of stuff that the previous owners didn't want, and the bedroom that I would share with my 3 sisters was full of stuff as well. We found dolls from the 1920s, old newspapers, and an entire series of Life magazine in pristine condition, all of which they let my mum sell. It took us weeks to clear all of the boxes out of that room. We had no curtains on the 2 windows to the right, which my sister slept under. The moon shone straight through, illuminating right up to the edge of my bed. We had those thin blankets with one edge that has silk on it. I lay there under my thin blanket, hoping that sleep would soon find me. Just as I started to doze off, I heard heavy breathing coming from the right side, down past the windows. It was slowly making its way towards me. Assuming it was one of my sisters, I yelled, "Knock it off!" It went quiet, and I fell asleep soon after. The second night, my sisters were sound asleep, and that laboured breathing started again. It was raspy, desperate, and once again slowly creeping towards me. So I sat up, and once again I yelled, "Knock it off!" and lay back down, expecting it to stop, just as it had the night before. This time, however, it did not stop. It just seemed to get heavier and darker, and kept creeping towards me. So I sat up again. The full moon was illuminating the entire area the breathing was coming from. I thought, this time I'll see which of my sisters is trying to scare me. And again I yelled, "Stop it!" Now, I could see most of the room, and nothing was there but that dark, raspy, terrifying breathing creeping closer and closer to the end of my bed. I could clearly see that there was nothing there. I quickly laid back down, shaking in fear, and covered myself with my thin sheets. Horrified and terrified as each breath crept closer and closer to me, inch by horrifying inch. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I do remember that breathing remained by the side of my bed, and I was too afraid to look. The next night, the same thing happened again, only this time it was moving towards me a lot quicker. Again, I yelled for my sisters to knock it off as I sat up. Again, the moon cast its light on that side of the room, but there was nothing there but that deep, dark, nasty breathing heading my way. It approached my bed, and I could hear it crystal clear, but there was nothing there. I went flat so fast and pulled the covers over my head. It seemed to work last night. I prayed it would work again tonight. But this time, it inched closer and closer, and seemed to get more and more desperate and grotesque. Now, it was right next to my bed. It began leaning over me, breathing harder and harder as it got closer. Suddenly, I could feel hot breath upon my face. That terrifying breathing was now right on top of me, and I was shaking with fear. I figured it had to be me. It just had to be my own hot breath coming back at me from inside the sheets. So, I decided to hold my breath, but that horrible, raspy breathing just continued. I held my breath tighter, and that breathing seemed to stop for a second. Then, I heard it take in a large, desperate breath, before it blew hard through my blanket. I froze, absolutely terrified. I figured this just had to be one of my sisters because I was holding my breath. Then it happened again. So I whipped my blanket down as fast as I could so I could see what was hovering over me. The room was illuminated perfectly, but to my horror, there was nobody there. Then, all of a sudden, right in front of my face, hot, disgusting raspy breath blew straight at my face with nothing in front of me. I could feel it, I could hear it, and I could smell it. I screamed in horror, shaking and crying, and jumped out of bed and ran as fast as I could. It was hard for my family to calm me down after that. I know what I experienced, and I know it was real. It was absolutely terrifying. In the 5 or 6 years we lived in that rental, not once did I ever set foot back in that room. Not once. I wouldn't even step across the threshold. It was shortly after my experience we found out an old man lived in that place alone. He lived there alone for years after his wife had passed away. And he died in that room, amongst his hoard of boxes and possessions. None of my sisters ever had that experience. I never had it again, but I avoided that room like the plague. This experience definitely sparked an interest in the paranormal. So, has this ever happened to you? Disembodied, ghostly breathing. I will never, ever forget it. I'm now 62 years old, and I remember it like it was yesterday. My church was built in 1875, so it'll be 150 years old next year. It's a big church and has 3 levels, but most of the paranormal activity seems to occur on the top floor, where the sanctuary and offices are. Directly off the sanctuary is a meeting/lunch room. We call it the GPR room. The choir singers will wait in this room before they come out to service. All the committee meetings are held in that room too, and it seems to be quite a hot spot for activity. None of the ghosts in that church seem to truly like crowds, but my mother cleans the church, and sometimes I like to help her. This means that I'm not very often in that church with lots of other living people. In that GPR room, there's a male ghost who often likes to whisper into your ear, like directly into your ear. And there's never any warning, so he catches you off guard and scares you every single time. His tone almost sounds confused, like he's asking you a question. And if you don't answer his question, he'll repeat the question a minute or 2 later. But the thing is, it's really quite difficult to understand what he's saying, as the words sound kind of muffled. So you have to tell him, "Sorry sir, I can't hear you," in which case he'll either repeat the question or just leave. He only seems to talk to you when you're alone in that GPR room. Only once did he ever speak to me when there was another person present in that room. At the very least, me, my mother, and my sister have each had experiences in that church with the Whispering Man. I've heard him about 4 times now. In the sanctuary, there used to be 2 green, fancy, felted wooden chairs directly behind the altar. When the altar area was renovated, those chairs were moved to a different part of the sanctuary. Sometimes I'd hear laughter and mumblings of conversation coming from the area where the chairs are now located. These voices definitely belong to women. I'd hear their voices and the pauses in between. One lady would talk, and soon after I'd hear another female voice responding, the voices echoing throughout the sanctuary. Sadly, once again their voices and their words were fairly inaudible. And those chairs were recently sold, so I haven't heard them voices in quite a while. As far as I'm aware, I'm the only one that's ever heard those voices. There's a little girl, no older than 8 years old, and she is the only ghost that fully manifests in that church. She wears a white dress that appears to date back to the late 1800s to early 1900s. She has Shirley Temple style curls and appears like a physical person, only with a very grey complexion. She almost looks like she's straight out of a black and white movie. She can often be spotted playing and giggling right at the back of the sanctuary. But one night last fall, I was sitting in the GPR room practicing for choir, when I looked up into the doorway leading into the hall. I thought I'd seen something in my peripheral vision, and when I looked up, there she was. That little girl was pinching the sides of her dress up so she didn't trip and fall. She was twirling around and around, watching her dress catch the air, flowing elegantly around her as she danced. She had a beaming smile on her face. I just sat there watching her, totally mesmerised. I just sat there smiling to myself with pure joy at the sight of seeing this little girl having so much fun dancing and playing to the sound of the pianist's songs. It was somehow blissful, yet haunting at the same time. I accidentally knocked something over on the desk in front of me. This caught the girl's attention, and she looked up and noticed me watching her. As quickly as that, she suddenly vanished with the blink of an eye. My mother and sister have both heard her giggle, and my mother swears that she saw her running across the back of the sanctuary where she plays. Thankfully, all of the spirits that reside in that church seem to be benevolent by nature, although I'm still not sure I'd like to be there alone in the dark. To begin, I'd have to mention that the house is an old farmhouse. It's set out in the country, with farm acreage at the front and state lands at the back. It's a fantastic location, with only a 10-minute drive into the nearest town. We only have one close neighbour, so it's pretty private for most part. The previous owner had bought the house on an estate auction. An elderly lady grew up in the house, and along with the house she owned many acres of land. I was told she died right here in this house, and I found her a few days later. I also heard that her son died here in this house too. Apparently he hung himself in the garage, although that was never actually confirmed. The house has been renovated many times through its different owners, including myself, but I'm not entirely sure how old the house is. I've attempted to look into the history of the house, and I believe it's very old. I think it was built sometime in the early 1900s. After we bought the house, we heard stories from the previous owners that the house might be haunted. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that this could be true. My first experience was when our dog was in the living room late one night. She was whimpering, like she was afraid of something, and staring at one of the walls, or maybe even one of the bottom rooms, but I couldn't see anything. I thought this was really odd, and called her over to me. One day, I was taking a shower when I heard someone tapping on the door handle. The handle was pretty loose, and could only make that sound if you pressed on it or tapped it downwards. I shouted, "Just a minute!" Then opened the door, thinking one of my kids needed to use the bathroom. But there was no one there. I asked everyone who had tried to enter the bathroom, and they all said at that point they were outside playing. I've always been on the skeptical side, so I just kind of brushed it off. There just had to be a logical explanation, surely. There is one room in that house, however, that does make me question my beliefs. Whoever has slept in that room has felt the bed shift violently, as if it's been pushed or kicked. It's also been said by people sleeping in that room that they felt someone sit on the side of the bed, and when they look, there's nobody there. All three of my kids, who are all grown up now, say that they've experienced this while sleeping in that room at some stage in life. The funny thing is, they all didn't learn about this until years later. I had told my son not to tell my youngest daughter, as she might be too afraid to sleep in that room. Eventually, we came to find that she had experienced it too. My husband has heard someone calling his name while he was sleeping, at least 7 times within a 3-month period. He's also heard footsteps walking around downstairs when he's been home alone. One time in particular, I'd just gone home from work and I was talking to my husband. As we were talking, my cell phone started to ring. When I looked at the screen, we were both in absolute shock. Our house phone was calling my cell phone. We both looked at each other, panicked. We knew that we were the only people in that house. Asked him, "Did you try calling me before I got home?" And maybe that's why the house phone is calling me back. Of course, he said no, and that would have been very weird. On another occasion, I heard my daughter's voice calling out to me, "Mom," when she wasn't even home. My husband also heard my daughter call out the word "Mom" too, when he was also home alone. We thought it was my son at first, but when we checked, there was nobody there. Only once did I ever feel scared when I was home alone. I had just come home from work and was relaxing when all of a sudden I heard some really loud banging coming from upstairs. It was coming from one of the bedrooms, and it was pretty loud. It was 10:30 p.m. by this time, so I was really freaked out. Initially thinking it was an intruder, I rushed to the kitchen and grabbed the largest kitchen knife we had. I kept looking up the stairs, wondering if maybe I should go and investigate to find out what had made such a loud noise. My husband was at work, so I called my son, who was at a party 30 minutes away. I told him what had happened and that I was freaking out, so he came back home with several of his friends to the house. They were all carrying weapons and did a full sweep of the house, inside and out. My son even checked the crawl space underneath the house. As it turned out, they didn't find or see anything that could have made that noise, and there definitely wasn't any intruders. I felt safe knowing that there wasn't anybody inside the house, but I know what I heard. Something caused that banging. I've heard the wooden floor creaking as if somebody's walking on it from just 10 feet away, with nobody in sight. I've never really felt a bad vibe, other than that time with the banging upstairs, and I've never really felt scared. If you've ever experienced anything like this, let us know in the comment section. The hospital I used to work at had a paediatric unit that turned into a regular surgical unit. From the time when I was a nursing student, there were rumours of a child that could often be seen wandering around on the staircase. Supposedly, a young patient who had passed away on the unit. When I got a job there, people still talked about it. After a few years, I started working night shifts, and the lights in the hallways were turned off. So many times, while I was standing in the hallway charting, I swear I would see somebody standing in the corner at the door leading to the stairway. Maybe it was a mind over matter kind of thing, but it was real enough that I ended up getting an eye exam. So I ended up going to get glasses and started charting in the nurses' stations. I found out that nobody would stand alone in the hallways charting at night, because they frequently saw shadows moving around. On 2 separate occasions, I had patients ask me who the kid was in their room. Both times, it was the same room, on the former paediatric unit, closest to that stairwell. It would be between midnight and 2 AM, and there was no longer a paediatric unit at that hospital, so I had no explanation to give. A couple of times, I personally had encounters whilst on that stairwell. I had to take paperwork to the unit on the floor above if a patient got upgraded. I would hear footsteps running up or down the stairs, and on one occasion I heard someone call my name. It was as clear as day. I ended up taking the stairs all the way up to the roof, just to be sure, and there definitely wasn't anybody there. The doors are really noisy, and I would have heard if anybody had slipped out. I ended up running back down the stairs, and eventually I simply refused to be on the stairs alone. One night, I had to go down to the basement to the lab. I refused to take the stairs, and so I took the elevator. As luck would have it, the elevator got stuck. My phone had no reception, and I ended up having a full-blown anxiety attack. Finally, the door opened at the basement level. I dropped off the specimen at the lab, and on my way back, I had a decision to make. Take the creepy stairs, or risk getting stuck in the elevator again. So, as I'm standing there making this decision, the huge metal door next to me slammed really loud. It was as if somebody had literally ran at that door and body slammed it really hard. That's when I realised. This door was the door to the morgue. I yelled, "Hell no," and ran to the staircase, where I literally fell up the stairs in a panic. I actually injured myself enough that I had to have surgery on my knee. I asked everybody, and they all said that nobody works down there at night time. It's just a place to store bodies. I even went to the security room where they monitor the cameras, and they swore to me that nobody was working down there. Although they did see me freak out and run to the stairs. After a few months, I ended up going back onto day shifts. I just couldn't handle that creepiness anymore. So, my ghostly encounter occurred about a year and a half ago. It's a short story, but it creeped me out nonetheless. I work as a law enforcement officer, so as such, I was tasked with sitting in on an inmate for the night, who was in the hospital ICU. The night started much like any other night of hospital duty, and as usual, The ICU was very quiet. However, at some point in the night, the silence was disturbed by the sound of alarms. Nurses and doctors started piling into an adjacent room to attend to an individual. Before long, the alarms and commotion coming from that room soon ceased. The nurses and doctors went back to doing whatever they were doing before, and silence fell upon the ICU once more. I glanced across the hall and noticed that the nurses had drawn the blinds and closed the sliding door that led into that room. I didn't think too much of it and continued with my duty of overseeing the inmate. The inmate was sedated and there was nobody else in that room. Shortly after the incident in the adjacent room, I was sitting in my chair, fighting to stay awake, when I was suddenly alerted to the motion-activated sink in my room, which appeared to turn on by itself out of nowhere. I found this quite odd, but presumed that the sink maybe had a fault or something. The water ran for a few seconds before turning off again. About 5 minutes or so went by when I was just settling back down, and then it happened again. Only this time, it didn't just switch on, then switch back off again. It switched on, then off, on, then off, repeatedly. This time, it really felt like somebody was trying to grab my attention. I was definitely put on high alert. It really creeped me out. When the tap finally stopped running, I looked across the hall and noticed that the hospital staff were pushing a bed out of that room. At this point, it was quite obvious that a body was being covered up by a sheet and blanket. Unfortunately, the patient in the adjacent room had passed away. Upon the deceased individual being removed from ICU, I didn't experience that tap turning on or off again. This was definitely the creepiest thing I've experienced while working on hospital duty. I'm not one to jump to paranormal conclusions, but this just seemed like too much of a coincidence. What do you think? I'm an ER nurse. I'm usually the one from my unit that responds to codes coming from other units. One night, a little after 3 AM, we heard the code come through the intercoms. Code blue, rehab bed 331. Code blue, rehab bed 331. So, we rushed up the stairs. I flew past our house supervisor and she asked, "What room is it?" To which I replied, 331. She asked me to wait and called to the front desk to verify the room. "Are you sure it's not 231? And they responded, "No, it's definitely 331. The board is definitely showing room 331. She had a perplexed look on her face. She requested that security be sent to room 331. She told me that there wasn't anybody in that room. We arrived to the floor and could see the blue light flashing outside that room, but the door was locked. Security opened the door. We walked into an empty room and deactivated the code button on the wall. We all looked at each other, freaked out, but we tried to make a joke about it and headed back to our department. To be honest, we all felt a little chill up our spines and wondered who or what could possibly have set off that alarm. That very same night, I saw a patient lying in one of my assigned beds out of the corner of my eye. I turned to introduce myself, but to my shock, there was no one there. I went about my night, trying not to pay too much attention to it. At this point, I just tried to ignore it. or pretend it didn't happen. Have you had any experiences in hospitals? This happened a few years ago, in October 2017. I lived in a small town in a rural area. We had the only hospital for a while, and all of the mental health services in the country. I worked as a psychiatric technician through a mental health service, and worked graveyard shifts monitoring patients who needed one-on-one care. Typically, I worked in the ER, with people in their most acute states or withdrawing from meth. However, toward the end of my time in that town, the mental health service I worked for contracted with the hospital and created a wing for psychiatric care. We would still have to transport patients across the state or to the next state over for long-term hospitalisation. But the ER was becoming irritated, as we'd sometimes have to hold patients there for 3 or 4 days before we could find somewhere else for them to go. When you walked into the ward, you'd be faced with a corridor which had 3 rooms on each side. Immediately to your right, there was a room which was used a bit like a living room. The 2 rooms closest to the door which led to the rest of the hospital, being used as an office and a break room for snacks. The night before the incident at hand was my first night working on the ward, and actually the first night that that ward was open. I was working with a very young but lucid and intelligent patient who I'd been working with for the last few days. She told me she felt a very weird energy in the room, and I personally had been seeing orbs here and there. I chalked it up to being in an old hospital at night. Plus, my town was well known for being paranormal. Hell, my own house was haunted. It was what it was, but it certainly felt heavy in that ward. Even the populated and well-lit ER had a creepy vibe, but this was something else. The next night, I was working with another young girl. She was also a very bright young girl. When I arrived at work, I let myself in through a door near the ward and made absolutely sure it was locked behind me. Shift change went smoothly, and then it was only me and that girl on the ward. We were separated from the rest of the hospital staff by several hallways, which had empty, day-use offices. If I needed any assistance, I was to contact the social worker on call. The girl I was looking after didn't want to go to sleep, and she definitely didn't want to go to sleep in her own room. She wanted to stay with me in the living room area. She had been there the night before too, and said that she felt scared in her own room. She and the other patient had no communication, and she had a different nurse monitoring her the night before. I didn't see a problem with this and agreed that we could spend the night in the living room. Shortly after I arrived that night, the hallway lights went out. I attempted to turn them back on, but had no such luck. I shrugged it off as poor wiring in an old hospital, in a ward that hadn't been used for a very long time. I made a note about it, and we went back to playing our board games. A few hours had passed by, and this kid really did not want to go to sleep. We both went to the break room at the back of the ward to get a snack. In the corner, behind the door, there was an IKEA table, with screws and small parts sitting on top of it. I left the light on in that room to illuminate that part of the hallway. I couldn't see very well without the hallway lights. We played some more games and then watched the Disney Channel. I heard a really loud banging noise. It seemed to be coming from the vents, and I thought, okay, the AC and heating unit must be really old too. Eventually, I turned the TV off and told the patient to go to sleep. Again, she insisted on sleeping in the living room, which I was okay with. We were pretty casual with patient requests, as long as their health and safety wasn't compromised. For a little while, I just chilled on the chair, scrolling through my phone. When I knew that the girl was sound asleep, I decided to get up and go to get a snack from the break room. She was out cold, and she wasn't there for suicide or self-harm, so I figured it'd be pretty safe for me to make a quick dash to go and get a snack. I began to get a feeling of dread as I approached the break room, and when I reached the door, I realised that the light, which I had left on, was now off. My heart started beating in my chest as I looked into that room. When I turned the light on, I noticed straight away that IKEA table was no longer in the corner of the room. It was now positioned in the middle of the room. It was upside down, and the parts had flown everywhere. I sprinted back to the patient, who was still fast asleep. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to sound crazy. I was the lead technician, and I had a good reputation at my work. Still though, I knew that I needed to contact the social worker. It was 4 AM at this point, and she came down to observe the table and the broken lights. I could tell she was scared. We made a call to the police, who arrived and deduced that the unit was completely locked down. Nobody would have been able to get in or out. There was only one door leading into this unit. This door was in my line of vision the entire time, and had remained closed until the social worker arrived. They found nobody else in this area of the hospital that wasn't supposed to be there. That room with the IKEA table has CCTV cameras in it. When we reviewed the footage, a chill went down my spine. The footage clearly showed that table in the corner of the room, and then it glitched. When the screen returned to normal, the table was in the middle of the room, upside down. Patient had never left my side, apart from that one moment when I found the table upside down. I even had to stand outside the bathroom door, with the door partially open when she needed to use it. She was very small, and there's no way she could have flipped that table, even if she'd managed to get out of my sight for long enough. The cops had no idea what to make of it, and were just as shocked as we were. The doors, the glitched footage, and the fact that the unit was locked down. My boss and the big boss arrived first thing in the morning and checked the place out. Nothing was ever said about the incident again. I asked my mum if she had heard anything, because she worked for the same company that I did. She said that whenever that incident was brought up, it was instantly dismissed. The patient was unharmed and completely oblivious. She stayed asleep the whole time, even when the police were stomping around. She woke up during the next person's shift and went on to be treated somewhere else. I never worked in that ward again. I was needed for transport monitoring in the ER, for patients too unstable yet to be on ward. I also did some work in peer counselling out in the community. I moved away from that town about a month later when I was offered a new opportunity. I spoke to my now ex-husband when I arrived home from work that day, and he said that he thought it was a poltergeist. I guess they tend to be drawn towards young children and pregnant women. Unbeknown to me, at that time, I was pregnant. I've had paranormal encounters before, but this one was certainly the most unsettling. My earliest paranormal experience happened when I was around 4 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night and really needed to pee. My bedroom was directly across the hall from the bathroom. My sister's door was on the right, and my parents' was diagonally across the hallway right next to the bathroom. I stood in my doorway and looked left and right, as you do, even though my sister's bedroom door was literally like 15 inches away from mine. Left, right. Then, as I glanced down the hallway, towards where it opens up into the living room, I could see a shadow figure. I couldn't see any distinguishing features because, well, it was a shadow figure, but I did know that it was looking directly at me. I stood there, frozen on the spot, staring at this thing, while my heart was pounding in my chest. And then it just kind of melted down the wall. Imagine you're standing with your back against the wall, and bend your knees and slowly lower yourself down to the ground. It was just like that, but there was no sound at all. I didn't make it to the bathroom that night. Years later, I moved into a townhouse apartment in Columbus, Ohio with my friend Tom. This 2-story townhouse had a huge basement. Most of it had been finished, with carpet and everything. Then, behind a walled-off section was the unfinished part, with the washer, dryer, water heater, laundry chute and furnace. From day one, our dogs wouldn't go anywhere near the door to that basement if the door was open, and they'd growl and snarl and bark if it was closed. Not long after moving in, we noticed some banging noises coming from down in the basement. First, we wrote it off as the water heater or furnace making noises, but it grew louder over time. It got to the point where you could feel the vibrations through the floor, and picture frames would vibrate on the walls. To further disprove the appliance theory, it happened when we were too poor to pay the utility bills, so we had no heating or electricity. One night, something woke me up, all the way upstairs. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I'd heard something. Just as I was drifting back off to sleep, I heard Tom scream "shit" at the top of his voice. He was sleeping on the couch downstairs. There was nothing else after that. He was still fast asleep. But it startled me so bad, I just lay there with my heart pounding. That was when I realised that it just seemed too quiet in the house. That silence was disturbed when the laundry chute door, which was just outside my bedroom door, started to slowly creak open by itself. Once it was fully open, I heard that really loud banging noise through the floors and walls, and eventually the banging even started coming up through the laundry chute. It got to the point where it was almost deafening. Then, the laundry chute door slammed shut in an instant, and everything fell silent. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. One day, my parents were bringing me their old washer and dryer because they'd just bought new ones. It was early afternoon, and it was bright and sunny out. I decided to go down and make sure the pathway was clear. My abnormally large golden retriever, Jake, decided to come with me. I walked down and made a 180 at the bottom of the steps. Then walked towards the door of the unfinished part of the basement. Just as I reached for that doorknob, something hit the door from the other side with such force that the door bowed out towards me. I'd never seen my golden retriever move so fast. It was like a golden blur. 1 second he was by my side, the next second he was gone, whimpering all the way back up the stairs. After taking a moment to calm my own nerves, I inspected the door. That's when I noticed a small crack running right down the centre. I know it wasn't there before. My parents arrived with the washer and dryer and set it all up for me. It was all good. Shortly after this, we moved out for financial reasons. In 2010, I moved into a condo in Huber Heights, Ohio. My sister moved in with me for a while, as I was a single mom and she wanted to save some money. Not long after moving in, my son, who had never had night terrors before, started waking up in the middle of the night screaming, staring and pointing over to the corner of his room. I just figured it was a new place, so he probably hadn't settled in yet. My sister and I both kind of felt like something was off. Like we'd be out all day, come back, and things would be slightly moved. Ornaments would be turned around so they were facing the other way. Curtains would be pulled behind the plants sitting in the windowsills, when they should have been pulled closed in front of them. Just things of that nature really. My sister, who is an insomniac, would sit at her laptop working all night. She often felt like she was being watched, and always felt like she wasn't alone. And she would often hear footsteps walking along the carpet of a night time. Finally, after a month of my son waking me up every night, I went into his room one day, sat on his bed by myself and started talking. I said, "Listen, you're scaring my child, please leave him alone." I felt really dumb doing this, but I was completely at my wit's end. And guess what? After that day, my son never woke up screaming again. However, that night, my closet door opened and closed by itself. I had the master suite. One whole wall was made up of sliding glass doors. Opposite that, the other wall consisted of accordion-style closet doors. My bed was situated right in between them, about 18 inches from those closet doors. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a sound, but I couldn't make out what it was. Nothing else happened, so I presumed maybe I dreamt it. I shrugged it off as outside noise and turned over, facing towards the closet to try to go back to sleep. My eyes had just started to close when I noticed it in the dark. That closet door, right in front of my face, was slowly sliding open. I jumped back so hard that I almost fell out of bed. I reached for my bedside lamp in a panic and flicked the switch. As I turned the light on, I turned around just quick enough to see that closet door slowly close again. I was completely freaking out and spent the remainder of that night with the light on. From then on, I had frequent experiences with that closet. I'd be lying in bed when suddenly I'd hear the clothes in that closet start swinging backwards and forwards. Rustling, moving, the clothes hangers rattling. Then the door would slide open and close, as if something was intentionally trying to scare the shit out of me. Now, accordion-style doors are notorious for wearing out and not sitting on the tracks properly. But not these ones. These ones fit perfectly. You'd have to put slight pressure on when closing them, but when they were closed, they fit tight. It took a fair bit of pressure to open them too. It wasn't just the door being loose or built up pressure in the springs. Something was opening and closing that closet door. Eventually, I just had enough of those closet doors opening and closing. So I decided to tie them together at the handles to stop them from opening. This was a big mistake. It only seemed to antagonise and provoke the entity. One night, just as I was falling asleep, I could hear those doors slowly rattling. Just quiet enough for me to hear it. But soon enough, that quiet rattling turned into violent shaking of those doors. I sat up in bed, absolutely beside myself with fear, when all of a sudden 3 loud bangs on those closet doors caused them to derail. In an instant, the room fell silent again, and I just sat there in floods of tears. After a week or so, I started hearing what sounded like shallow breathing and mumbling coming from inside the closet. I couldn't make out a single word. I can't even be sure it was English. As I was getting ready for bed that night, I started pleading loudly. "Please, just stop. I'm exhausted and I want to be left in peace. Can you please just let me sleep tonight?" Apparently, the entity had other ideas. But we'll save the rest of the story for the next video. I wanted to share an odd experience that happened around 2 months ago. To be clear, I've never been a believer in ghosts, and I still can't say for sure that I'm a believer in the paranormal. Having said that, I have absolutely no explanation for what happened here. I was on holiday with my dad in northern Italy in our family apartment. The apartment previously belonged to my grandmother's brother. Me and my dad were on the sofa watching TV and having a relaxing evening. Out of nowhere, a vintage bottle of brandy flew off a shelf in the kitchen and crashed violently against the wall on the other side of the room, smashing into pieces all over the floor. Both me and my dad witnessed the entire thing, and neither of us could believe what we'd seen. The bottle had been sitting there for years, and the shelf that it was sat on was very sturdy. I considered that maybe gas had built up in the bottle, causing it to explode. However, brandy isn't fizzy, so this couldn't be a possible cause. Even if the bottle wasn't sturdy on that shelf and had fallen off, it should have fallen straight down. There is no way that bottle should have flown 2 meters across the room and crashed into that wall. It seemed very much like that bottle was launched by someone. We considered all possibilities and tried our best to rationalise, but nothing made sense. Then we thought about possible poltergeist activity. Could it have been my grandmother's brother? I never knew him when he was alive. Or maybe my mum, who passed away just a few years ago, trying to get our attention. I've been desperately trying to wrap my head around this for a while now, and I've never experienced anything like it since. If anyone can relate to this story, it would be nice to hear your thoughts. I just recently moved out of a house that I'd lived at for about 6 years. My family and I moved into that house when I was about 13 years old. We moved in with a family friend whose parents had passed away just a few years beforehand. Not much really happened there, other than the usual, seeing things out of the corner of your eyes and things like that. Nothing too scary or memorable. The way the house was laid out, from the living room, you were able to see down the hallway through a galley kitchen, right through to the back door where a half bath was, and the washer and dryer hookups. Occasionally, when I'd glance up at the black TV screen in the living room, I'd see something absolutely terrifying. I would notice what appeared to be the figure of a woman standing in the middle of that hallway. It was just the outline of a woman standing there still, and what looked to be long black hair falling down past her shoulders. She appeared mostly black, like a shadow, so you couldn't really make out any facial features or anything. At first, I would find myself just staring at that shadow in the reflection of the TV. Then I would turn to look down into the hallway to see nobody there. But every time I would turn to look back into the TV screen, there she would be. Countless times I would search that area to find something to rationalise what I was seeing, but I never found anything. Maybe coats or clothes, or maybe just the way a certain shadow had been casted. But nothing. I would look back up and she'd still be there. After some time, I'd become somewhat desensitised to it. She never moved, and she never made any noise. She just stood there, still. Knowing there was no danger, and that she meant no harm, I simply just ignored her any time I saw her standing there. None of my family members ever mentioned seeing anything. Once we had all moved out, I presumed that it must have just been my mind playing tricks on me way back then. I started dating my now boyfriend a few months before we moved out. He had visited our previous house a few times and stayed there once in a while. Today, me and him were sharing some of our ghost stories from our childhood, and I started to talk to him about some of the things I saw in that house. But before I even began telling him what I'd seen in that TV screen, he cut me off. He started to get really freaked out. He said that one night he'd got up to go and get his soda from the kitchen to bring back to my room. He said that once he'd grabbed his soda, immediately he felt like he was being watched. He described to me exactly what he saw when he looked into the reflection of that TV. I started trembling and became very emotional, realising that it wasn't only me that had seen her. He described the exact same thing that I had seen. But he said he was much closer to her than I ever was. He said when he looked into that reflection, she was standing right behind him, right over his shoulder. And yet, even he couldn't make out any distinguishing features, just that long black hair. He had only seen her one time, but it was still terrifying for me to realise that I wasn't the only one to see her. I called my dad to ask him if he'd ever seen her, and he said no. He said that occasionally he'd see someone walking around our house, but he never saw anything in the reflection of that TV. As of right now, as far as I'm aware, we're the only two people that ever saw her, which makes this encounter even more peculiar to me. I have no explanation to this day. I really wonder why she was there. This has been going on for months now, and it's really freaking me out. Over the past few months, strange things have happened while I'm trying to sleep. Almost every night, my bed will randomly shift as if it's being kicked, and my foot will feel like it's being crushed, as if somebody decided to take a seat on my bed and watch me. I've heard whispers and sniffing right next to my ear, as if this entity has a pet dog or something. I always feel like I'm being watched. My room is in the basement, where the only things that should ever make sounds in the middle of the night are pipes and vents. There should be absolutely no reason for the washer to change settings, which can only be done by a dial, or something smacking against the water heater loud enough for me to hear a clear thud. This isn't the same sound that I hear when the heater is cooling down or heating up. That's much quieter. This sound was very loud and very deliberate. Items will randomly fall over, or fly off the shelves and crash against the walls. I've lived in this room for 2 years now, but the activity only started around 9 months ago. The scariest incident I'd experienced up until this point happened around 2 months ago. Admittedly, I do suffer from paranoia, so up until this point, I just put everything down to me being paranoid. At 10 AM, I got out of bed, got dressed, and went upstairs to the kitchen to make breakfast. As clear as day, I heard an adult female voice say, "Yes, he's awake." It sounded like it was coming from right behind me. It couldn't possibly have been my mum, because she was at work, and she's the only woman that lives in our house. I wasn't imagining things or hallucinating. I've never hallucinated in my life. I was wide awake by the time I'd left my room, just like always. My family think I'm going crazy, as nobody else has heard or seen anything. Clearly she likes me. Why else would she be so excited that I was awake? I don't really sense a threatening feeling from her, for now at least. However, it's still really creepy, and it's still really freaking me out. How do I get her to stop? My friend suggested that I try to make contact with her, but I really don't want to encourage anything. This is terrifying. What if I say something that provokes her? She's already demonstrated that she can move things. She seems to be most active at night. At one occasion, when I heard her voice, was the only time anything's happened during the day. A few months have passed, and I've been sleeping in the games room since then. In hindsight, this probably wasn't the brightest move, as the games room is situated right next to the basement. But if I don't want to sleep in the basement, it's the only option I've got. The games room isn't fully underground, more like halfway, whereas the basement is fully underground. The games room is where me and my brothers will play video games together. I thought I'd be safe here, as this is the room that our 3 huskies sleep in. Today, I got up off the futon at 6:30 am and went to turn on the lights. This is a much normal time for me to get up, and it probably explains why she was so excited that I was finally awake last time. The games room is L-shaped, with the futon, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch all in the short segment of the L. The light switch is right next to the sliding glass door in the corner of the L. The PC is down the long arm of the L, between my room and the stairs. As I reached the corner of the L, I could see something from the corner of my eye. Hesitantly, I turned around, hoping that it was just my imagination. Of course, it wasn't my imagination. There was a woman sitting in the chair next to the PC. She was Caucasian, with long, brown, wavy hair reaching just past her shoulders. She was wearing jeans with a plain sky blue t-shirt. I'd say she looked at least 5'10", as she was taller than me, and I'm 5'7". She looked very gaunt, as if maybe she had starved to death. Just then, she reached out and turned on the PC monitor. This isn't one of those touchscreen ones. You have to actually press a button. Both the PC and the monitor turn on this way. I ran back to the futon and hid under the blanket, as this was all I could do. To get to the stairs, I'd have to run past her, and I wasn't about to do that. She didn't see me, or at least I don't think she did. She seemed fixated on the monitor. By the time I re-emerged from the blanket just a few moments later, the chair was now turned to face me. But she was gone. I'm very curious to find out more about who she is, why she's here, and what she wants, etc. I just can't work up the courage to try to make contact with her. I'm petrified. I'd probably need a spirit box or something anyway, which I don't have. Is there any way to make her leave without trying to contact her? Maybe using sage or something. Since that time when I heard her voice, we had the place checked for carbon monoxide, and all the checks came back clear. Which of course is great news. The bad news, however, is that there's a ghost in my house. When I was 17 years old, the cool thing to do at the time was to visit the Embryville Asylum in Chester County to explore. This asylum has been abandoned since the 1980s. At one point, it was a mental institution. Then, it was an elementary school. Then, it was a hospital. And finally, it was a home for the mentally unwell. The asylum consists of 10 to 12 buildings, each roughly the size of an elementary school, all of them dilapidated. There is an unmarked cemetery across the street, with numbers on each of the graves, but no names. I went with a group of about 8 people at roughly 10 PM. We started by going into several of the closer buildings, which were creepy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, we proceeded to what was known as the main asylum, which was by far the biggest and oldest building. This one really gave me the creeps. As you might imagine, there were gurneys in the hallways. Things were just scattered everywhere, and the whole place just had a really cold vibe. We started moving through the building and made our way to a stairwell. I took the lead position and started moving forwards. My buddy and I made our way to the 4th floor, and we soon realised that the others hadn't followed us. We went on ahead anyway. We approached a hallway intersection where to the left and right of us were large day room type areas. These areas had hallways that led to open rooms, which widened as you entered. Before I turned the corner, my buddy said to me, "Did you just say something?" To which I responded that I hadn't. He told me he swore he heard someone say something. At this point, I turned the corner and pointed my flashlight towards the day room. In clear view, I saw something cross from left to right within the threshold of that door. It had the figure of a person, but with my light directly on it, I could see that it had no pigment. It was like the absolute absence of colour or light, blacker than the night outside. It had dimensions to it, and it was human-shaped, but it didn't seem to have any legs. I grabbed my friend, and we turned tail and ran as fast as we possibly could. I never went back to that place at night. I left there feeling cold and terrified, and it's stuck with me since that day. I still think about it a lot. What do you think I saw? So, last night my husband had to go to hospital with our youngest. He's okay, but they didn't get home until around 4 AM. Meaning, I was alone with our other 3 kids. So, it all started when I went to the thermostat to turn the heating off for the night. It was around 9 PM. Just as I turned the dial, I heard "Mum" from over my shoulder. Initially presuming it was one of my kids awake and out of bed, I promptly turned around and said, "What's up?" My heart dropped, as I immediately realised there was nobody there. Our cat was staring straight into the bathroom at something. But after what had just happened, I didn't dare investigate. I tried to brush it off and told myself I must have just been imagining things. I turned on the AC and went to check on the kids. They were sound asleep, snoring and drooling, all of them. Then I went to my bedroom, which was right at the back of the house. All the cats went to lie on my bed. I crawled into bed and started scrolling through my phone, when I heard what sounded like something being thrown in my living room. I jumped up immediately and could clearly hear what sounded like something being dragged along the floor. This was followed up by bare footsteps smacking quickly across my living room floor. Now I was sure one of my kids had gotten up and were messing around. I rushed into the living room and shouted,
"What are you doing?"
And all I could see was the remote across the other side of the otherwise very neat living room. It was on the floor, and the batteries were on the floor not far away from it. There was nobody in my living room, especially not my children. At this point, I was absolutely terrified, thinking somebody was in my house. So I decided to do a sweep, as my dad calls it. I walked around the house, clicking on every light. I opened every door and closet. Everything was now on. My kids started to stir, but they were still asleep, so I decided to shut their doors and turn their lights off. I determined now that everything was clear. I could find nobody anywhere. Totally confused, but still thinking about potential intruders, I went to the bathroom in my bedroom at the back of the house and texted my family. I explained to them what had happened and said maybe I was losing my mind. My heart rate started to calm back down again, and I was checking my phone for updates from my husband. Suddenly, In the doorway to the bathroom, with the door open, I could hear my daughter's tiny voice say, "Mummy?" I've never known such terror in all my life. My stomach dropped. My blood felt like ice. Just this horrible feeling of dread washed over me as I looked up from my phone, hoping to see my daughter, but deep down knowing there was nobody there. In a panic, I decided to call my dad. He called the police and immediately drove over to my place. The police arrived pretty quickly, but found nothing of any concern. My dad also found nothing, but stayed with me until my husband arrived home. Do I sage the house? Do I call a priest? Or do I just try my best to ignore it? I have seen shadows moving out of the corner of my eye since we started renting this place. What would you recommend? I want to share a personal experience from a time when I was venturing into an abandoned building. At the end of the story, I'll share a photo with you, in which I appear to have caught something quite disturbing. I am a 20-year-old female. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, me and my friends liked to go to abandoned buildings and be adventurous in our tiny town. We decided to visit this military hospital that was quite popular in our town for kids of our age to explore. At this point, it was pretty much just a junkyard and looked incredibly spooky at night. My friends went there before me and told me that they'd found an Ouija board in the attic. This, of course, sparked our curiosity, and we really wanted to go to investigate further. I remember having so much anxiety about the whole situation and decided to snap a photo of the building before we went in. I was really scared of getting lost on my own in this huge old building. The access to the upstairs from inside the building was full of clutter and stuff to barricade the dangerous steps leading up to the attic. However, somehow we made it up to the attic, and I was the first to walk in. All of a sudden, I was hit with a terrible wave of sickness. I genuinely felt like I was going to puke everywhere, so I stepped aside and let everyone else go in while I waited back. To be honest, the rest of the adventure wasn't nearly as terrifying as the attic. When we got home, I decided to look through all the photos and videos that we took whilst we were exploring. As we were scrolling through the photos, I noticed something in my very first photo that really gave me the chills. See if you can spot anything strange about this photo. If you look closely, you can see a person standing in front of that building staring straight back at us. There was a few of us present at the time, and we all swear that there was nobody else there as we approached that building. We've been through all the photos and footage, and nobody else was wearing the same clothing that the person in this photograph was wearing. My mum has a friend that claims to have medium abilities. This lady had a look at the photo. She insisted that this entity was conjured to the building because my friends took that Ouija board. Please let me know what you think. Did we catch a ghost on camera? Do you have any photographs where you think you've caught something of a paranormal nature? So, I just moved into a new home a few months back. One night, I was sitting on the couch in the living room, watching TV at about 11:30 PM. I'd just gotten home from work, so I was absolutely drained. I was kind of just sitting there, staring into space. For context, my living room sits on the far right side of the house, In the middle is my kitchen, and on the left-hand side is my bedroom. I was just drifting off with the TV on, when suddenly I could hear what sounded like somebody aggressively going through my belongings in my bedroom. Initially presuming there was an intruder, I looked over into my bedroom and could quite clearly see that there was nobody there. My hairs started standing on end, and I totally froze up. I stared back at the TV because something in my head was telling me, do not look over there. Before I even had a chance to contemplate what was going on, the situation went from scary to downright terrifying. Out of nowhere, I could hear footsteps stomping at me at full speed, from my room straight across the kitchen. It stopped right in front of me as I was sitting on the couch. It was so loud, I literally flinched and shielded myself, out of sheer instinct because I really thought something was about to strike me. As the footsteps reached me, the room filled with an absolutely putrid smell that I can't even begin to describe. Every hair was standing on end, and my stomach dropped. I felt physically sick. However, this wasn't the only experience I had in that house. Every evening, before I went to bed, I would deadbolt the front door. However, on the odd occasion I'd wake up in the morning, and the front door would not only be unlocked, it would be wide open. My back door is situated in the kitchen. Plenty of times, when I've been sitting in my kitchen eating breakfast, I've heard and seen the handle to the kitchen door moving up and down. I don't just mean shaking a little bit, I mean violently moving up and down. It was as if somebody was trying to get out, or indeed in, to my property. I've been in my bedroom with the door closed, and heard what sounded like somebody crying on the outside of my door. I could hear words amongst the crying, but it was fairly inaudible, so I couldn't really understand it. I was just begging for it to stop. The last thing I'll mention is when I was standing at the top of my stairs, ready to walk down, when I heard footsteps coming up the stairs towards me. It sounded like they were dragging their body across the wall as they walked up the stairs. I really think it's time for me to start looking for somewhere else to live. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Ever since I was young, I've always had a sense of spirits being around me. My parents tell me stories of when I was a kid that would really freak them out. So I decided to share a couple of them here. My grandpa died when my dad was about 15 years old. There was one particular day, we were visiting my grandma's house. It was my dad's childhood home, and I was sitting in my grandpa's old recliner chair. My dad said, when I was sitting in that recliner, I went from acting like a normal child, so all of a sudden just sitting there very still and quiet, staring into space. He said I suddenly looked at him and said, "Hey, Fargo," and then went back to being my normal self. Fargo was a nickname that my grandpa used to my dad when he was a kid. I was only a 5-year-old child, so there's absolutely no way that I would ever have heard this name being used. He said it freaked him out pretty bad, so we ended up wrapping the visit up very soon after that. My dad moved around a lot when I was between the ages of 12 and 18 years old. When I was 15, he lived in the foothills of Colorado. Somewhat secluded, but still close enough to the nearest urban neighborhood. One day, I was sitting in the basement playing video games, when I heard what sounded like the footsteps of somebody running down the stairs. I had 4 other siblings, so this would have been fairly common. So, I looked over to the stairs to see who it was. All I saw was a flash of blonde hair running towards one of the downstairs bedrooms. I thought nothing of it because my sister had long blonde hair. so I just went back to playing one of my video games. About an hour later, I went upstairs to my dad and asked him where my sister was. I wanted to ask her what she wanted when she came down to my room. He looked at me with a really confused look on his face. He said, "Your sister can't have been anywhere near your room this morning. She's been at her friend's house all morning." My dad ended up getting the house blessed. The next morning, flames shot out from under the stove. But this was blamed on a leaky gas line. A bit later on in life, when I first started dating my wife, we stayed over at her parents' house quite often. My wife grew up in an old farmhouse, which was built by her great-grandparents. One night, while I was asleep in that house, I dreamt that I woke up to an old lady standing over me. She was dressed in clothing that seemed to be dated back to the early 1900s. I could sense an extreme amount of anger coming from this lady, and I definitely didn't feel like I was welcome in that house. I woke up drenched in sweat, and my Apple Watch indicated that my heartbeat was at around 150. I described in great detail the dream to my wife's dad. In turn, he showed me a photograph of my wife's great-grandma. She was, without doubt, the woman that I saw in my dream. He told me she was a very mean and bitter old lady who didn't appreciate having guests in the house. If you've ever experienced anything like this, please let us know in the comments. I recently moved into a new apartment. The landlord had informed me that the previous tenants moved out under mysterious circumstances. They left in a hurry, but never really offered an explanation. I wasn't too sure what to make of that. Regardless, I was super happy to finally get a place close to work. After being here for about a month though, strange things started to happen. I started waking up in the middle of the night to what sounded like somebody clearing their throat right next to my ear. Naturally, I'd open my eyes, scan the room, and see nobody there. Then, in the mornings, before hopping in the shower, I'd notice scratch marks across my neck. I figured I'd probably inflicted them myself in my sleep without realising, and just disregarded them. However, some things have happened this week that make me reconsider that. As an avid book collector, I have a little bit of everything, including some children's literature. I keep all the picture books on the bottom shelf. This way, my nieces and nephews have easy access to them when they come to visit. Well, this morning, when I went into the kitchen to make breakfast, I noticed a picture book lying on the counter with a box of cereal next to it. This immediately gave me the chills. I live alone, and I certainly didn't put them there, and my family hasn't visited me at my new place yet. Nonetheless, I went about my day, ran some errands, and returned home later that day. As I approached my front door though, something caught my attention. I could see mist on my window, the kind of mist that you get when hot breath touches a cold surface. Pressed into that mist was a set of tiny fingerprints like those of a child. I tried rubbing them away, but they wouldn't smear, which meant that they were on the inside. Upon realising this, a chill ran down my spine. No children had been in my house. Unlocking the door, I quickly ventured inside, scanning the room and flipping on the light switch as soon as I walked in. There was nobody there, and nothing looked disturbed. So, I tried to forget about it. I cooked myself some dinner and went to bed early. About an hour ago, however, I was woken by the sound of laughter and the creaking of a swing. As I glanced out of my window, what I saw shocked me to my core. There was an empty swing, rocking backwards and forwards on its own. The following video is the footage that I captured. I used to work as an aide in an assisted living nursing home. I had this one guy who was sometimes very difficult to work with. He could be quite demanding, and he was a prominent figure in a wealthy part of the community, and he liked to make that known. Having said that, he could also be very kind and funny. He lived in apartment 45, and we'll call him George. Working in assisted living meant that every resident had a pendant that they could pull if ever they needed help. This would signal us on our beepers, because it was a fairly large facility. Anyway, the beeper would display something along the lines of Room XX, calling for assistance near Room XX, dining room, living room, etc. So, one night, George went out for dinner with some of his friends for his birthday. He was the type to follow the rules to a T, so he made sure he let the nurses know when he was leaving. He gathered his evening medicine, signed the resident log with the time he was leaving and where he was going, and said goodbye to the staff on the front desk. It got late, and he hadn't yet returned, yet nobody seemed too concerned. At around 1 a.m, the night shift nurse had to take a PRN pain pill to a lady near the back hall. The aide had called her over her walkie-talkie and said that room 39 needed a PRN pill. But, for some reason, in her words, she decided to take a shortcut across the courtyard. She never usually does this because it's not very well lit out there. There's only one tall street lamp in the courtyard, and a very small amount of light comes from a street light on the outside of the building, and that's all. As she made her way across the courtyard, she noticed George sitting on a swing in the gazebo, and this really startled her. She walked over to him and said something along the lines of, "Hey, I didn't know you were back yet." But George didn't respond. And as she got closer to him, she realized he wasn't breathing. He was a DNR, which means do not resuscitate. But she said, even if he wasn't, he was gone already. He was ice cold. Upon investigation, nobody was entirely sure when George had come back. He never signed back in, and didn't tell anybody that he was back. Although, allegedly, his friends had dropped him off outside at around 10:30 p.m. He had the code to get back in, so our guess was he just sat out there for a while until he passed away. It's definitely weird that he didn't sign back in or tell anybody that he had arrived back. Fast forward a couple of months, and I had pulled a double shift. 3 to 11, then 11 to 7. I was helping to set up the dining room, when, at about 1:45, the beeper went off. When I looked at that beeper, a chill ran down my spine. My co-worker and I were absolutely shocked. Lo and behold, 45 was calling. Not only was room 45 paging for assistance, assistance was required in the courtyard near the memory care unit. We were totally creeped out. I called over the radio to the other aides and nurses working and asked, "Are you guys seeing this on the pager?" Everybody was getting spooked. The pager continued to go off for the rest of the night. This was because we didn't know where it was to clear the call. We came to find out the pager for room 45 was locked away in a drawer in our supervisor's office with all the other unused pendants. This event happened to me when I was a teen, many years ago. I've always had issues with sleeping, even when I was a kid. Mostly, I'd put this down to depression and anxiety issues. One time, I was up in the early hours of the morning trying to read a book. I decided to get up, stretch my legs, and fetch myself a glass of water. Then, I went to use the bathroom and wash my hands. Being a kid, I decided to stare at myself in the mirror for a lengthy period of time. I was trying to see how long I could keep my eyes open for, just trying to pass some time and make myself sleepy. Then I started making funny faces at myself in the mirror, as young kids do. I found it quite amusing at first. That was, until I saw something that sent shivers down my spine. I started laughing to myself at some of the ridiculous faces I was pulling. However, my reflection didn't laugh back at me. In fact, it just stared straight back at me. It almost looked distorted, with a cold, blank expression. It was as if it was staring straight into my soul. I've never been so terrified in all of my life. I ran straight back into my room and hid under my blankets, anticipating what might happen next. I listened in silence as my heartbeat raced, but nothing happened. I waited and waited, but there was nothing, and eventually I managed to calm myself down and regain my composure. Even as a kid, I began to rationalise with myself. I told myself that I was probably just sleep deprived and seeing things. Also, I know that the brain can trick you and create images when you stare at something for too long. I tried my best to put it to the back of my mind. However, the next morning my mother asked me why there was a small crack in the mirror. Again, my hairs stood on end. There was no crack in that mirror the night before. My mother said she hadn't done it. My brother said he hadn't even been in the bathroom, and my father was still fast asleep. I have absolutely no explanation for that crack in the mirror, and while I'm sure there is a logical explanation, it seems very coincidental. Since then, whenever I look into the mirror, I try not to stare for too long, out of fear at what might look back at me. For context, I'm a 33-year-old female, and this happened when I was 16 years old. It was roughly 2006, back when I still lived with my parents. The house was huge, with the bottom floor being bigger than the top, and the stairs being right down the middle of the floor plan. There was 2 stairwells leading up to a landing. One on the side of the front door and living room, the other was on the side of the kitchen. After the landing where these stairwells met, another stairwell led right upstairs to a wraparound upper floor with a loft. Well, on the wall of the upper landing, just before the stairwell, hung an ornate mirror. I grew up with a fairly large family. I guess this is a given, as my parents were Mormons. I'm not part of the church anymore, but that's beside the point. In total, there were 8 kids in my family, and 5 of us were still living at home There was always plenty of noise and laughter, and lots of running around up and down the stairs and hallways, etc. Especially on the evenings during weekdays, and pretty much constantly during the weekends. It was all just happy family vibes, lots of people enjoying themselves. Well, most of the time anyway. You see, that mirror that hung up on the landing always had some kind of negative energy. In fact, at times it felt so off, it really ruined the vibe. Like, I'd be chasing my sisters playing tag or something, and I'd run past that mirror, and all of a sudden I'd get a chill right down my spine. It happened every time I moved past that mirror, accompanied by a feeling that somebody was watching me out of the corner of my eye. It got to the point where every time I walked past that mirror, I felt compelled to look at it, like I was trying to catch whoever it was that was staring at me. I knew logically this didn't make any sense at all, but it didn't stop me from instinctively doing so. Most of the time afterwards, I'd just go back to doing whatever it was that I was doing, playing with my sisters or something. However, there were times where I'd lay awake at night, just wondering why that mirror spooked me so much. And it just got progressively worse. In fact, it got so bad at one point I had to have a conversation with my mother and tell her just how scared I was of that mirror. Now, my sister, two of my younger brothers, and my father all happened to be present at the time of this conversation. When I said this, they all just kind of stared at me, and an uncomfortable silence followed. When I asked what was wrong, and why they were all looking at me in that way, my mother finally spoke up. She told me that actually, she felt the same about that mirror. And one by one, everybody in that room started to agree. I asked them if anybody had mentioned this before, spoken about the way they feel about that mirror, and they all just shook their heads and said no. My dad said he even felt freaked out by me just mentioning that mirror. It was as if we were all scared into silence by that mirror. Nobody had ever said anything to anybody else about the ominous feeling, and here I was, voicing everyone's fears. That's when I knew for sure. My gut feeling about that mirror was spot on. My mum took it down immediately, since we were all in agreement that it shouldn't stay there. Just out of curiosity, I asked her where she'd got it from in the first place, and she said she couldn't remember, which is strange because my mother has a really good memory. Most of the things she owns have some kind of interesting backstory. Usually, they had been passed down to her by my grandma, or she'd got a really good deal in a yard sale or something like that. I found that this just added to the mystery surrounding that mirror. A few weeks passed after my mother had disposed of the mirror, and I started to forget about it. One night, I invited a few friends over to stay. We were all talking and laughing, when one of my friends asked where that mirror was. My other friend responded, "Yeah, I noticed it was gone too. Did it break or something?" I shook my head, no, and told them my mum had got rid of it, but I didn't tell them why. They both exchanged a glance. Then, one of my friends said something that literally sent chills down my spine. Oh my god, I'm so glad. I felt like someone. And then she was abruptly interrupted by my other friend, who chimed in. "You felt like someone was always staring at you from that mirror?" Horrified, we all looked at each other and agreed. We all laughed it off, but it didn't seem like they found it genuinely funny. It was more of a nervous laugh, like they were trying to calm themselves down or something. I told them all my family felt the same way, and that's why we got rid of it. Nobody ever really spoke about the mirror after that. It was gone now, and we all just moved on with our lives. But there were a lot of freaky things that happened in that house. and maybe I'll discuss them here one day. I know it may seem silly, but that mirror seriously gave off some sinister vibes. Everyone seems much happier now that it's gone. But sometimes I still wonder what happened to it. I wonder if somebody else got hold of it after my mother threw it out. I really hope not, as the thought of that mirror bothering some other family really doesn't sit well with me. Especially since I don't know exactly what was wrong with that mirror, and to be honest, I don't think I want to. Look, I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, and poltergeists, etc. I never have done. I am a Christian, so I do believe in demonology, but not manifestations or hauntings. Mostly, I just believe that we can be misled by our own selfish desires. I think that entertaining those selfish thoughts and getting into bad habits and addictions are the real demons we have to battle with and fear in life. For this reason, I have no explanation for the following encounter. On the afternoon in question, I was home alone and my wife was out running errands. I spent a lot of time home alone, so this wasn't unusual for me in any way. I was scrolling through social media and watching some videos when I heard my wife come through the front door. It sounded like she was carrying some plastic grocery bags from her trip to the store. This was a pretty common occurrence, as my wife loves making excuses to get out of the house, whereas I'm more of a homebody. I got the notification on my phone that the sensor in the kitchen had detected movement. The doorway in the kitchen leads right out into our hallway. From here, you can see people pass by the kitchen door as they cross the hall. Shortly after this, an alert came from the living room camera, which had also detected movement. Again, nothing unusual. We have kids, so we set the cameras up in the family areas so we could keep an eye on them as they play. The cameras come in handy when the kids get into arguments or try to deceive us in any way. The cameras also allow us to speak to them as we run errands. Our kids are older now, so we often leave them home alone. So, after taking note of the alerts, I kept scrolling through my phone, waiting for my wife to come upstairs to the bedroom. After about 20 minutes or so, I could no longer hear my wife, and the motion alerts had stopped. That feeling you get when someone's in your house had now disappeared. I listened very closely, but couldn't hear anything. I called towards the stairs for my wife, but got no response. I got off the bed and started walking down the stairs, calling for her as I went, and yet still, there was no response. When I got downstairs, I checked all the rooms, and I was really puzzled because she wasn't there. I know for certain I had heard her, and I felt her presence in that house. I stepped outside to see if she'd ran out to her car to get something, but her car wasn't there. Now, I was really puzzled. But I eventually came to the conclusion that she'd forgotten something and went back into town. I thought it was strange that she didn't come up and say anything, but maybe she thought I was taking a nap. I made my way back up the stairs and decided to give her a call. I called her on her cell phone, and when she picked up, I asked her where she'd gone. She simply responded she was still out running errands. I asked, "Why didn't you come up and see me when you came home a minute ago?" She responded, "What do you mean? I've been gone for hours." "What?" I said. "You were down there for like 10 minutes. I heard you come in carrying bags. There was a motion alert and everything. I could have sworn it was you. Who the hell else would have come into our house?" There was a pause as we both considered this. She started to get worried and said I should check the cameras. I agreed and told her I'd call her back shortly. Now, my heart was starting to pound a little bit. Who the hell came into my home? Why did they walk in, then leave? Had they taken anything? Was this the first time? Were my children still safe here? Nervously, I pulled up the motion cameras on my phone. I started scrolling through the kitchen footage to just before I'd walked down the stairs. I pressed play on the recording and waited. I clearly heard a slam, followed by a few knocking sounds like someone was coming inside. Then, the grocery bag noises started. Now, I could really feel my heart pounding in my chest. Someone had definitely come inside, and I was about to watch them stroll past on my camera. As I leaned in closer to the screen, a dark shadow suddenly loomed into view and crossed my entry hallway past the kitchen door. I could make it out as clear as day as it passed by the screen. I was in complete disbelief. What in the hell was that? The camera was slightly distorted from it. It didn't really have any recognisable shape or any distinguishing features. The only way I can describe it really was just a shadowy, shapeless cloud. I switched to the living room camera and played it again. Same noises, only this time I watched in full view as the shadow came from the hallway into the centre of the living room. Then the entire room went dim on the camera, as if a shadow had fallen across the whole room. This was in the middle of the afternoon. Were the cameras messing up? No, I had heard and felt someone in my house. I've been here for 10 years and I've never been wrong. What was that thing? The scariest part was, just as I came down the stairs on that recording, the room lit up again like normal. It was like on a sunny day when a dark cloud rolls over and your whole room goes dim. Only the sky was completely clear. There wasn't a cloud in the sky that day. I've never been more terrified in all my life. I was sitting in the house alone, watching footage of me walking down the stairs towards whatever that thing was. I watched it over and over again, in complete disbelief. I knew for certain I heard someone walk into my house. I felt their presence. There was absolutely no question in my mind that my wife had come home. Only she hadn't. I called my mum because I was so freaked out. I explained what happened and showed her the footage. She just shrugged it off, as did my wife. In hindsight, I guess there really wasn't that much to see. Just some strange noises and a shadow. As I said, I don't really believe in ghosts. I never have. But something was in my house that day. My grandma's house, for as long as I can remember, has always been a scary place. My dad, aunt, and uncle all grew up in that house, and each of them say they had paranormal experiences occur throughout their lives. One example of this was when my dad and uncle were teenagers. My uncle was walking down the stairs and was swinging a towel. Out of nowhere, my dad, who was standing in the living room at the bottom of the stairs, saw the towel straighten out in front of my uncle, as if somebody had pulled it, and my uncle fell violently down the stairs. Now, my grandma hates all paranormal things, especially Ouija boards, so it's a big no-no in our family to talk about the paranormal experiences from that house. Approximately 20 years ago, my brothers and cousins were playing in the upstairs bedrooms in my grandma's house. The toys were all set up in the room directly across the hallway from them. They were all in the same bedroom playing a board game. They could hear some commotion coming from that other room. In unison, they all looked out into the hallway. What they each said they saw is absolutely chilling. Out of nowhere, a Hot Wheels toy car, with no batteries, no wind-up mechanism, started moving out of the other bedroom into the hallway. That car slowly moved across the hallway into the room that they were in. Needless to say, they were all absolutely terrified and ran out of that room like a shot. Around 8 years ago, my oldest brother moved into the basement of that house. One night, when he was home alone, he was asleep in the basement. He woke up from a deep sleep, having felt like he'd been physically shaken by someone. He stood up and said that he could instantly smell something strange, almost like the smell of tea. He went upstairs and outside the house. We phoned my dad, and to cut a long story short, we found out that there was actually a carbon monoxide leak. If he had not woken up, there's a very strong chance he'd have died in his sleep. Months later, while my grandparents were away on holiday, we decided to download the Ghost Radar app and use it in the house. We all sat around the phone, and my uncle started asking the usual questions. Is there anyone there? Etc. Then he asked, who used to live in the basement? At this point my brother had moved out. The Ghost Radar app replied with my brother's full name. Nobody ever calls my brother by this name. We were all really shocked. So then, my uncle asked, how did you save him? It replied with wake. We were all starting to get really creeped out by this point. Then he asked, what did you save him from? And the app responded, gas. Needless to say, we were all gobsmacked. The last thing to mention is that in that house, my grandparents' friend's obituary would turn up in the kitchen every month or so. Their friend passed away probably 15 years before. They usually say hello to their friend and then put the obituary back in the basement where it belongs. A little while later, it will inevitably show back up in the kitchen. Please leave any thoughts on this story down in the comments section. To begin with, this happened about 10 years ago, and I've only ever told this story to a few people face to face. And the majority of people I've told don't believe this story to be true. It was honestly the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me. This experience changed me from a condescending skeptic into, well, let's just say I'm a firm believer in the paranormal now. When it happened, I was 22 years old and in my second year at university. For the record, I didn't drink or take drugs. I was living in the Stoke area of the UK, and I was renting a house with my girlfriend and a few friends. It was a mid-terrace house. It was dark and creepy because it only had windows at the front and back. It had a dingy, damp, dark basement with lots of old furniture stored inside. There was a black cat, which I befriended and fed because it would show up at the back door every night meowing. The house was also situated in a dark, creepy, muddy cul-de-sac that served as a communal courtyard and car park. However, none of this really bothered me all that much. As a child, I grew up in a creepy old house that was built in the 1800s. As I later learned, however, this house did bother my girlfriend and my housemates. My housemates told me later on that at night they would hear footsteps in the hallway and in the adjacent living room, only to find nobody there when they'd sneak out to take a look. I also discovered, a year after this event, that the students that lived there before we did couldn't wait to move out. Apparently, this is all because they firmly believed that that house was haunted. My term time ended 4 weeks after all the other housemates. This was because I had to do a clinical placement. This meant that I lived in this creepy, old house alone, which to be honest I kind of loved at the time. I'm a massive introvert, so I love time on my own. It started great. For 2 weeks, I really kind of enjoyed it, despite the background creepy vibes. I would just rationalise any creepiness away, as I still do now. However, after the 2-week mark, I became aware of this creeping sense of dread that I just couldn't rationalise or shake. I'm not an overly anxious person, and as I've already said, I enjoy time on my own, and up to this point, nothing really weird had happened. However, I began feeling very unwelcome, and very much not alone. I began feeling how a prey animal must feel when they feel the eyes of a predator on the back of their head. I began feeling so scared that every day I would take the 3-mile walk onto campus and sit and study in the library, even if I wasn't on placement. I'd come home and be living in fear. I even designed a system for moving around the house at night without ever being in an unlit area. I also did this during the day in the windowless areas. I became so scared that I had to move from the largest bedroom into the smallest bedroom. At night, I would lock the door and sleep with my back to the wall. I would often sleep with the light on, and I was inexplicably afraid. I couldn't wait for the final day to arrive, and when it did, I had to lock all the windows, turn off all the plugs, get some stuff from the basement, and lock the back door before I left. I was utterly terrified, and felt like I was moving in slow motion the whole time. I went around systematically making sure a light was on at all times, and that I was never in darkness. I had piled all my stuff, backpack and duffel bag, at the front door. The rest of my stuff was mercifully packed in my car the day before. This is where the story gets really chilling, and I cannot adequately explain what happened. It was late afternoon and still light outside, but the house inside was very much dark. I braced myself to turn the hallway light off. The light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, about 4 meters away from the front door. It was pitch black upstairs. This is normal because there were no windows and all the lights were off. I turned the light off and scurried away without turning my back to the stairs. Daylight still lit the hallway from the front door, but as I got to the door, the most terrifying thing happened. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I'm not too proud to say that if I had needed to pee at the time, I would have peed myself. I could see a black and vicious, shadowy mass slowly manifesting in front of my eyes. It started at the top of the stairs and was slowly creeping down the stairs towards me. I felt such malevolence. I basically tripped backwards out of the door onto the street. I lay on my back, staring up at this entity. I slammed the door shut with my foot and felt instant relief. I locked the door and posted the key through the letterbox as quickly as I possibly could. That was the last time I ever saw that house. The only possible way to explain the way I felt was to liken it to a dementor or a ring wraith, except there wasn't a caped humanoid figure chasing me. It was more of a fog with no distinct shape. The fear and dread was indescribable, and I've never since experienced anything like it. I had and have no mental health issues. I was very happy with my life and wasn't suffering with any stress at the time. I even feel crazy and slightly embarrassed telling the story, but I swear on my life it's all true. Has anyone else ever experienced anything like this? This story was experienced and told to me by a friend. He said it happened not long after the 9/11 tragedy, It was approximately a year after, and I've never forgotten what he told me. So, my friend had moved to New York City to find a job and somewhere to live. He found an apartment in a beautiful brick building that was owned by a woman who lived not far away in the Brooklyn area. She was looking to rent the place out. She was very sweet, and she said that she hadn't been ready to rent the place out for some time. But she felt that now the time was right, and after meeting my friend, she said that she thought he was a great fit for the apartment. He had a friend local to the area who also needed somewhere to live, so he decided to move in with him. It was a great arrangement, since this friend was gone almost 90% of the time. He travelled a lot for work, which meant that he was usually gone for long periods of time. He let his friend have the bedroom, and he slept on the futon. It was never confirmed at the time, but my friend believed that his friend was single. For this reason, he felt there was very little to worry about in terms of other people being in the apartment. When he first moved in, he noticed that the lady had left a nice scarf hanging up on the wall and a basket with some shoes in the closet. One morning, my friend was awoken from a deep sleep. He heard the front door unlock, open, close, and then lock again. Then, whoever had just entered the apartment went into his roommate's room and shut the door. This seemed to happen quite frequently. Somebody would come home late at night, go into his roommate's room and shut the door. These just seemed like normal occurrences, things you'd expect when living with someone else. They had opposing sleep schedules, so my friend didn't really pay that much attention to it. For this very reason, for a while, he just assumed that it was his roommate. He would hear the shower turn on, doors open and close, pots and pans clattering in the kitchen, things like that. He thought he was a great roommate. He always seemed to clean up after himself and put the pots and pans back where they belong. It didn't really look like anyone else had ever even been in the kitchen. He was watching TV one day when he actually caught sight of a young woman pass through the apartment. He just assumed that this girl was his roommate's girlfriend. He said she was young and pretty and looked around the same age as his roommate. She hung up her scarf in the hallway and made her way into the bedroom. He said she never seemed to speak. She just smiled and made herself scarce. He said whenever his roommate was back home in between jobs, it came to my friend's attention that his roommate was actually really untidy and quite lazy. He didn't clean up after himself, and he left his belongings everywhere. Eventually, after confronting him on this, my friend said to him, "Your girlfriend seems to do a pretty good job of cleaning up after you all the time." His roommate responded, "What are you talking about? I don't have a girlfriend." My friend said, "Well, some girl keeps coming in, she must have your key. She's been sleeping in your room and showering here." His roommate didn't know what on earth he was talking about. So, just to be safe, they agreed to change the locks and get some new keys. However, after just a few weeks, the young girl was back again, showering and cooking, or at least making the sounds as if somebody was in the kitchen. The scarf on the hanger in the hallway would occasionally disappear and then appear again. Clearly, this girl, whoever she was, wasn't getting the picture. The landlady called my friend to ask how everything was going. She said if he needed anything for the place, just to give her a call. Being his landlady and all, he just assumed she was being really nice. He felt lucky to have the place, and didn't want to complain to her about something like this. After a while, both roommates spoke again, and figured they didn't know who this girl was or how she was getting into the apartment. She seemed nice, but neither one of them knew her. They had tried their best to make the place secure, but nothing seemed to work. Soon after this, his roommate would have to leave for about a month again, so my friend would be in the apartment alone. My friend decided to call the landlady to ask her what they could do about their female intruder. When he described the young girl he was seeing in the apartment, the landlady seemed visibly shaken and upset. What she told him chilled him to his core. The landlady explained that originally the apartment had belonged to her daughter, but she had been killed in an accident. She explained that her daughter had lived in that apartment alone, and the scarf in the hallway and the shoes in the closet all belonged to her. She said that when she was cleaning out the apartment, she couldn't find that scarf or the basket of shoes anywhere. She just presumed that she'd already gotten everything out. My friend moved out soon after and decided not to renew the lease on the apartment. He told his roommate later about what the landlady had told him. He also decided to move his things out of that apartment and find somewhere else to live. The landlady believed that her daughter was still present in that apartment because she loved it so much when she was alive. She believed that she was coming and going and taking her favourite scarf with her when she left.